Hi and welcome to part 2 of video 12 in the series on executive coaching. I'm Harry Petropoulos. I'm one of the founding directors of Red Pill Performance Consultants, which is an executive coaching business established in 2004 with offices in Sydney and in Perth. You may recall in part 1 of this video, I talked about psychopathy as a bit of a precursor to talking about subclinical organisational psychopaths. Let's begin perhaps by reviewing some of the stats. For a start, we know that psychopaths make up between 1 to 3% of the adult male population and between 0.5 to 1% of the adult female population. And we also know that there's a higher percentage of psychopaths in business than in the general population. But it gets even more interesting with research indicating there are far more subclinical psychopaths than actual psychopaths in the general population. Recent studies conducted in the US and Sweden showed rates of between 5 to 15%, with the rate being a little higher in Sweden, perhaps as a legacy of the old bygone biking era, but who knows. These findings suggest that for every 20 people you encounter in your life, whether you're a coach or not, up to 3 of them are likely to have subclinical psychopathic tendencies. That's a pretty sobering thought. Now, of course, like all mental illnesses, psychopathy isn't a black and white condition. According to psychologist Kevin Dutton, as he said in his book, there's a scale of madness along which we all sit. But from a clinical standpoint, by definition, psychopaths score high on the Hare PCLR psychopathy scale, usually 27 or more out of a possible score of 40. You and I would probably score somewhere between 2 to 5. Subclinical psychopaths would score somewhere in the vicinity of 20 to 23. On the Hare test. But while Hare's instrument shows high test validity and high reliability, it's somewhat academic to us as coaches out in the field, as it's actually quite hard to test for psychopathy in the workplace, given few leaders or coachees would willingly submit to psychometric testing and to being interviewed by a shrink. That means that in most cases, our diagnoses are based on anecdotal observation rather than a systematic, rigorous assessment. So as coaches, while it's important to trust our gut feel in relation to evidence suggesting the presence of psychopathy, whether full-blown or the subclinical version, we should concentrate more on the aberrant behaviours under scrutiny rather than seeking to label coaching clients as either narcissists, psychopaths, or even subclinical psychopaths. Okay, so how does the subclinical psychopath differ from the full-blown version? In their book, Almost a Psychopath, authors Ronald Schouten and James Silver state that the difference between a psychopath and an almost psychopath, or subclinical psychopath, is one of degree. That is, what distinguishes the full-blown from the almost psychopath version category is the frequency and intensity of behaviours practiced. Subclinical psychopaths can be narcissistic and grandiose and see themselves as being superior to others and not bound by society's rules. They can be manipulative, are comfortable with lying, and are prone to blaming others for any behaviours they themselves have been caught out on. For example, he should have known I was in a bad mood. That's why I shouted at him, is a response that you might typically get from a subclinical psychopath. The subclinical psychopaths are able to exercise just enough self-control and display just enough context-specific, albeit shallow emotions, to avoid being caught out easily. As authors Schouten and Silver say in their book, the almost psychopaths are never likely to be your ideal employee, neighbour, spouse or parent. They may be able to get along well enough to keep steady employment and maintain relationships. And while the almost psychopath still uses others for personal gain, they're careful not to irretrievably push those people away. And when they do overstep the mark, the subclinical psychopath will effortlessly bullshit their way through a string of excuses, apologies and promises in order to preserve the relationship as well as the future opportunities for personal gain, of course. So while subclinical psychopaths can actually show some degree of empathy and can function quite normally in most cases, they seem to have the ability to compartmentalise this empathy. Psychologist George Simon refers to this capability in his book In Sheep's Clothing and suggests it's almost as if they can put their empathy into their mental lockbox when they want to prey on someone. When you think about it, this trait actually makes subclinical psychopaths far more dangerous than their full-blown counterparts, who can't demonstrate any empathy at all. For instance, a subclinical psychopath may love their children and love their spouse, but they can easily lure you in by demonstrating empathy, but they can just as easily turn on you very, very quickly. Initially, they're able to suppress their natural urges to talk about themselves long enough to focus all their attention on you, just to draw you in. But later you'll see glimpses of their egocentric and egomaniacal thinking. That is, eventually they just can't resist telling you just how great they are. The thing that neither the full-blown nor the subclinical psychopath can hide very easily is their belief in themselves as superior beings. Now, when a coaching client starts to show disdain for another person, for instance, someone they view as not as smart as they are, it's a pretty strong indication of a psychopathy or the presence of some psychopathy in their personality. Now, as professional coaches, we're of course alert to the possibility of encountering personality disordered coachees, so we scan the environment for all the telltale signs. In real life, however, identifying someone as a psychopath or even a subclinical psychopath doesn't usually come as an immediate realisation. As Shoughton and Silver say in their book, it sneaks up on you one odd experience, betrayal or deception at a time. Now, even as a seasoned coach and a registered psychologist myself, I've had a recent experience outside of my coaching practice where I was almost duped by someone who, in hindsight, displayed many of the hallmarks of at least a subclinical psychopath. From a coaching perspective, the fundamental assumption of any coaching program is that the person seeking coaching actually wants help and is willing to change their behaviour. But of course, psychopaths and subclinical psychopaths don't typically seek help because they don't feel they've got psychological or emotional problems and see no reason to change their behaviour to conform to societal standards of which they really don't agree with anyway. Psychopaths see themselves as superior beings in a dog-eat-dog hostile environment in which others are competitors for power and for resources. So let's assume that you've been invited to coach someone who the sponsoring organisation values quite highly in terms of their unique contribution to their firm, but also someone who the sponsor feels has shown signs of derailment in one or more aspects of their leadership style. So while the initial brief may have been pitched to you as leadership or executive coaching, after your initial meeting with the coachee, you've gone back to the sponsor and suggested that the coaching is more remedial in nature. Based on your initial interview with the coachee and followed up, of course, with interviews involving a cross-section of people in the organisation with whom the coachee interacts, plus your desktop review of relevant performance reviews and 360 reports, let's assume that your professional assessment is that the coachee displays some characteristics that may be consistent with subclinical psychopathy. But in your estimate, this person is probably not a full-blown psychopath. And importantly, let's assume that you don't believe that the trail of bad behaviour is severe enough to warrant dismissal or even reassignment. So what do you do next? Well, first of all, you'll need to be clear that as a coach, in these situations, your primary responsibility is to the organisation rather than the specific employee receiving the coaching. Now, this is a bit of a juggling act because, as I said in an earlier video, psychopaths and subclinical psychopaths have rights as well. They're employees of the organisation. But these must be carefully balanced with the company's desire to eliminate the damage being caused by this employee's aberrant behaviour. The next step in the process is to establish the coachee's willingness to participate in the coaching program and their underlying motivation for doing so. If willingness is low, there's probably a disconnect between the coachee's reading of their organisation's ongoing tolerance thresholds for the coachee's poor behaviour, or as is more often the case, the organisation hasn't had the courage to spell out what it's prepared to accept and not accept going forward. In any case, as coach, you'll need to have a very robust discussion with the sponsoring organisation and the coachee, him or herself, in terms of the goals of the program. If you're unable to get clarity around this, my advice is drop the assignment. As far as motivation is concerned, you need to be clear that the motivation to receive coaching with subclinical psychopaths is really about wanting to change their perspective on life, or about wanting to become better leaders. After all, why change when you're so perfect? So motivation to participate in coaching is typically more about removing obstacles in their pathway to achieving some sort of reward, be it a promotion, a bonus, or some other form of confirmation of their supremacy in their particular given field. Obstacles encountered typically include things like receiving poor 360 reviews, complaints received from direct reports and sometimes customers, etc., etc. But that's okay. At least you know what the underlying drivers are for the program. Now, the emphasis for the coaching program is then less on self-directed learning and more about identifying and implementing strategies to keep the subclinical psychopaths' behaviours in check. Now, for instance, psychopaths and subclinical psychopaths often use unpredictable and aggressive outbursts consciously to keep everyone in a constant state of high anxiety, or to keep them on their toes, as a psychopath recently said to me. As coach, once you've identified this practice, you'd set about to raise the coachee's awareness regarding the inappropriateness of this tactic and agree alternative, more people-friendly options for promoting workplace productivity. In doing so, it's best to try to align the subclinical psychopath's self-gratification goal with company goals. For instance, their bonus and their career options will be reduced significantly if too many employees resign, or if bad 360 review ratings are attracted by the coachee. Now, as a backstop, you'd also encourage the sponsoring organisation to conduct more frequent 360 reviews on this particular coachee, ideally on an ad hoc basis, as a further reinforcement of the new behaviours the organisation is seeking, and also the organisation's seriousness about seeking these behaviours. Now, as coach, it's also important to seek to inoculate the people around the subclinical psychopath through education and awareness raising. Part of this inoculation process may involve the bolstering of the team dynamic to make it increasingly more difficult for the subclinical psychopath to isolate and victimise any one person in particular. And where appropriate, you may need to also teach stress management techniques to potential victims, as well as how to recognise symptoms of depression, anxiety, anger, etc. But you also need to ensure you have a mandate to do this from the sponsoring organisation. This is very important. This is typically agreed to at the beginning of the assignment, so you need to get your mandate clear. And if you need to revise the mandate during the course of the program, do so. Ideally, the management strategies you'll employ when you're coaching subclinical psychopaths would be based on around instrumental learning principles, and I'll talk about instrumental learning principles perhaps in a later video. And remember, unless you're a forensic psychologist or a psychiatrist, it's difficult to diagnose mental disorders with any degree of accuracy in a corporate setting. So as an executive coach, you need to watch out for confirmatory bias and keep an open mind throughout the coaching assignment regarding the underlying causes of the behaviour you're witnessing. It's quite possible, for instance, that this particular employee may not be a subclinical psychopath at all, but rather they may just be someone who has poor interpersonal skills, that could display compensatory narcissistic traits that marks perhaps a low self-esteem, or they could just have a short temper. It could even be a totally different personality disorder altogether. So you need to be careful about diagnosing somebody too quickly. And don't forget, the chances of achieving great outcomes decreases quite significantly in remedial coaching situations. So as a coach, managing the sponsoring client's expectations going in is going to be quite important. Okay, in the next video, I'm going to be discussing performance and performance coaching. So thanks for watching this one, and I'll see you at the next video.